We live in an era that seems to have become addicted to the idea of the simple, of simplifying, of simplification. From Staples' easy button to Nike's slogan of just do it, the overriding message is that simplification is the way to better everything. I am here to tell you that too much simplicity is perhaps more dangerous than not enough. Simplification can be dangerous, very dangerous. Thus, my lessons without the hype. Your mother told you this 1,000 times, but that does not mean you believed her or that you took it into how you live your life. There are no shortcuts to any place actually worth going to. But simplification and simplicity as shortcuts can be very seductive. After all, the pathways to success can be very complicated and very complex. There's a relationship between simplicity and effectiveness. When we make things simple, oftentimes we make them more effective. Our goal is supposed to be more and more simplification. But this graph with that nice upward sloping blue arrow, it contains a lie. The truth is that simplification works, but only up to a point. And after that point, it fails rather miserably. What happens when we oversimplify is that we offload the cognitive burden, the source of meaning, away from the simplification that we're using and onto the context and the environment of the situation that we are addressing. And in that offloading of meaning, we must deal with a second important truth, namely that every one of us is different, and we each will see and deal with the context and with the environment differently. When we simplify by transferring the cognitive burden, when we simplify by transferring meaning out to the context, what we're really doing is increasing complexity because, again, each one of us sees that context differently. And what happens is that our very idea of simple or of simplification crumbles under the weight of all those differences. As Albert Einstein told us, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Einstein's quote implies two things that are required for any effort to simplify to actually succeed: balance and appropriateness. Balance requires work. Appropriateness can be rather elusive. True simplicity has the added power of appropriateness. Yes, you probably could hammer the square peg into the round hole with enough force, or you might just break both the peg and the bench the hole was a part of. The goal is for things to fit together naturally, without any kind of force fitting. Appropriateness is a quality of attunement, of resonance, and of being one with the context. Oftentimes, we encounter ambiguity, and ambiguity challenges our notion of the simple. Two or more conflicting meanings need resolution, and that need for resolution, that ambiguity, can get in the way of our success. It challenges the notion of effectiveness. What it does is introduce a major source of complexity. Sometimes what we think is simple is because we have personally simplified it, but it may be better understood as being complicated or complex or ambiguous. And when that happens, our very act of simplification has let us down. It has left us confused. And then, sometimes what we individually may see as simple or obvious, others around us see as something else. Perhaps they see a different simple, or they see a reality which is more complicated than the one that we think we are addressing. Agreement and appropriateness are the key to every negotiation, every successful communication, every solved problem, and so too is having just the right amount of ambiguity. But agreement, appropriateness, and ambiguity all create the opportunity for misunderstanding. What kind of gas are we talking about here? If you ignore agreement and appropriateness, you can drown in ambiguity and the dissonance which results from the clashes amongst two or more conflicting and unresolved meanings. Instead of simple, you quickly find yourself in the complex, with layers upon layers of twisted and interconnected issues, all of which need resolution. Or you could react by simply doing nothing, frozen to inaction by the uncertainty which all that ambiguity, lack of agreement, and lack of appropriateness has managed to create. Richard Rorty, one of the 20th century's great pragmatists, noted that we deal with the problems of ambiguity, lack of agreement, and lack of appropriateness all the time. We tend to call them misunderstandings, or perhaps worse. Rorty said, knowledge is not a matter of getting reality right, but rather a matter of acquiring habits of action for coping with reality. When simplicity isn't obvious, when it doesn't just present itself to us, what we do is we create it. We engage in the act of simplification. Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, the simplifications that we deal with are our own constructions, a product of our own heads. What we do is create our own reality. We see the world, we process the world, but the way we process it is to tell a story which makes sense of what it is we think we see, of what it is we think we need to deal with. Most of the time, we do this by trying to tell a simple story. We say that the world is X, or the world is Y, or the world is Z. What we do is filter the reality that we see. How? Well, first, we limit our field of attention. We narrow the context of what it is that we are dealing with. Then, we limit the factors to be considered. We assert a set of boundaries and constraints. Next, we predict likely outcomes given the boundaries and constraints that we just imposed. In fact, at this point, what we've done is construct multiple realities in our heads. Finally, we pick among those multiple realities. By choosing from among our predictions, we have taken the complex, complicated reality that we first encountered, and we've managed to turn it into a simple construct. That construct becomes the story that we tell ourselves, the story that we tell others. It is the narrative that we use to explain the situation. But sometimes that simplicity is not necessarily the clear, unambiguous answer that we seem to be seeking. Indeed, simplicity does not mean certainty. Simplification does not mean that we will have a definitive answer. Certainty can be quite elusive. Look at this picture. Now look away. Now look again. What do you see? Are you sure? In the last picture, did you see the peasant girl? Or did you see the man? Or maybe you saw both. Did you see both at the same time? It's ambiguous. A problem with ambiguity and the lack of certainty is that the simplicity we seek may not be shared by other people. It's not that they do not share our goal, it's that they see something different than what we saw. So perhaps one of us saw the peasant girl, and another one of us saw the man. One lady sees 4, the man sees 3. And then we tell the story that we see, not the story that the others around us see. There is a simple lesson here. Context matters. The slice of pizza, which seems to be very appealing while it's sitting on the restaurant plate on the left, well, it seems to be anything but appealing while sitting on the manhole cover on the right. Of course, it's the same slice of pizza. Context matters. The focus on context reveals 3 words or ideas which all too often we get very wrong. The notion of simple, the story we tell, and the model that we use as the central character in that story. What happens with all three is that we tend to resort to shortcuts, and shortcuts lead to problems. Simplification works only when it is appropriate, when it has achieved the right balance. Otherwise, you find yourself in the chasm, and chasms are hard places to get out of. Consider, for example, McDonald's switch to all-day breakfast. It is simple. It is direct. It resonates. Every one of us can tell the story. This is an example of simplification just working. They got it right. By contrast, Amazon aimed for the simple with the notion of free same-day delivery. But, well, there's ifs, and there's buts, and there's fine print, and there's conditions. There's a list of things which qualify, and a list of things which don't. This is an example of simplification attempted and simplification which fails. There is no simple story here, though Amazon wants there to be. Indeed, to the listener, and quite often to ourselves, stories and labels are black boxes. We see a black box, but we have very limited access to what's inside it. We use the black box so as to simplify. By black box, though, I do not mean the one on an airplane which collects as much data as possible. I mean a set of words, or a sign, or a description, or a model, something that we use to simplify how we talk about some bigger thing. We use black boxes because we can refer to them like shorthand, instead of having to spell out the details of the bigger thing. And quite often, we use black boxes because they allow us to take one of those dangerous shortcuts. By referring to the black box, we can avoid having to actually learn the details of that bigger thing. But remember, shortcuts are often dangerous, and while our goal is to make the complex appear to be simple, we can overdo it. We use black boxes as if they were the more detailed, nuanced thing that they refer to. Black boxes like this allow us to tell stories about as-ifs. So we can talk about a road as if it was a straight line. We can talk about a drive as if it was one thing and not a journey through many places. We can talk about our job as if it too was one thing and not some interconnected network of many things. What happens is that we talk as if we are all talking about the same thing. But we are not. We each approach stories, labels, and the like from the background information we have in our heads and the context which we may be paying attention to at the time. Because we are all unique, it is a mistake to assume that the background information and context is the same between storyteller and the listener, or even amongst multiple listeners. The gap between what we think we are saying and what the listener is hearing is what provides the opportunity for that chasm. It is a place where both simplification and storytelling fail. It is a place where ambiguity reigns and where disagreements are the order of the day. Let's try this with an example. I imagine that we are all very familiar with the climate change debate. It is marked by rather vocal disagreements and very sharp dissonance. When you look at the graph of temperatures usually used to display global warming, this is the graph that you tend to see. Please notice the red line that slopes upward toward the right-hand side. When scientists and others who support the notion that global warming is an ever-present and ongoing problem speak about the graph, this is the conception they have in mind, that upward-sloping red line. But there is another way to look at exactly the same data. Instead of drawing one overall trend line, you can look for periods of stability amongst the rising trend. And that is what this version of the graph shows. It's the same data, but shown with a different interpretation. When contrarians suggest that there are opportunities in time where the rise in global temperatures have slowed or stabilized, it is this interpretation of the graph which they are talking about. It's the same underlying data, the same graph, but a different interpretation. These clashing interpretations are illustrative of what happens in the chasm of dissonance. We have a high level of similarity, but we have two conflicting interpretations. And as a result, people engage in fairly strong disagreements. What the climate change example highlights is that we are stuck having to deal with the not simple portions of the world. Just dealing with the simple is not enough. And in dealing with the not simple, we need to be aware that one critical part of appropriateness is balance. We need the variety of forces that we are dealing with to be in some kind of requisite balance, where requisite is defined by our objective. This illustration of the forces which apply to a flying wing is an example of what we will call requisite variety. The forces are various, and the various forces get balanced, but the nature of that balance needs to be appropriate to both our purpose, for example, are we flying, are we taking off, are we landing, and the context. What kind of wind is there, what kind of weather, what is the weight of the plane, etc. This chart begins to highlight many of the forces that need requisite variety in our storytelling. The story is often used as a mediator between the observations that we make about the environment and the behavior that we engage in or that we desire others to engage in. Requisite variety is affected by not only the observations and behaviors, but also by the feedback loops that happen amongst all these things. These feedback loops can amplify the effects of our observations or behaviors, or they could dampen them. And we must not forget that any situation we are in has a context, an environment. That environment will affect our observations, which may then affect our story, which may then affect the environment. And so too with our behavior, which may get modified by the environment, or our behavior may modify the environment itself. These feedback loops are critical to understanding why simple stories may not be so simple. The cycles can be very complex, and thus the cycles create, in part, our desire to simplify. But those cycles also govern whether or not simplification can actually work in an efficacious manner. If you remember from perhaps 20 slides back, appropriateness, like agreement, is a critical component of making simplicity and simplification actually work. Black boxes, labels, and stories can all be very powerful when they're used appropriately and when the listeners can agree with what they hear. They help to package those complex and ambiguous cycles I just showed you and make them actionable. Because the goal of any action matters, purpose is a major determinant of appropriateness, which means we need to know the goal, the why of the story that we're telling. And we need to have some idea of how the story we tell or the black box we use can help us get toward the goal. Let's take an example. This is the map, or a chart, if you will, of the London subway system. It's a great map if you're using it to determine how to go from station to station on the tube itself. But it is a horrible and misleading map if you try to use it to determine how to walk, or even worse, drive between the tube stations. The requisite variety of this map, its balance, is geared toward its purpose, which is to provide information about how to use the tube system. It is not geared to any other purpose. The map of the London tube station reveals that our society tends to trash a very important distinction, the distinction between a true model and a static description. Descriptions are representations used to simplify the system being modeled. One composes a drawing, symbol, or schema as a representation, and then gives that representation a label. And we use that label to speak of the system so described. Thus, when we look at that map of the London tube system, that indeed is how most of us think of the system itself. And if our purpose is to go from tube station to tube station using the subway, that representation works very well. But much is hidden in that representation. You can't use it to go walking or driving from station to station. The static description only works for the purpose for which it was intended, and it becomes fairly useless for any other purpose. Models and descriptions need to be remembered as distinct. But static descriptions are not true models. They have no possibility for you to simulate potential changes. There is no way for you to ask, what if, and see what happens. What ifs are essential before committing to action. True models allow what ifs to be simulated and include a means for any selected what if to be implemented. By allowing ourselves to conflate the meanings of these two words, description and model, we have lost the distinction which makes the difference. Only true models help you plan or simulate potential interventions. Descriptions cannot. True models explicitly describe how interventions are possible. More importantly, true models allow us to experiment by simulating what might happen in the representation before we actually attempt to intervene in the system itself. Models allow us to play. They allow us to experiment. They allow us to understand what might happen. The experiments we run or simulate are shown in the triangles to the right. As we run experiments, we simulate the what if. We see what happens under various scenarios, under various what ifs. This is shown by the feedback arrow. Then we pick one of the courses of action from among our experiments, and we attempt to implement it. If our model is a good model, then the intervention in the system will behave in a manner predicted by the experiment in the model. The better the match between what the model predicts and what an actual intervention produces, the better the model. Let's take an example. The plastic food, which is on display in many a restaurant in Japan, is an example of pure description. Remember, pre-given labels and categories can be very efficient. Much of our simple world works due to the efficiencies which result from the use of labels, categories, plastic food. Not everything needs a model. And if my goal is to order dinner, then the plastic food works. I can point to it. And indeed, first time I was in Japan, that's what I did. But if my goal is to actually cook dinner, well, then the plastic food is really not so helpful. For that, we have recipes. Recipes are models. We can imagine interventions. We can make changes to the ingredients or to the instructions. And then we cook dinner. Let's go back to the three problematic words: simple, story, and model. The issues which make them problematic all revolve around the concept of appropriateness. What is an appropriate model or an appropriate story? What amount of simplification is appropriate for a given situation and a given purpose? So just what does this seemingly all-powerful word, appropriateness, actually mean in our context? It turns out that appropriateness can be defined by how well the black box that you're using or the story that you're telling meets three tests. The first test: do you have a model or do you merely have a description? This tells you whether you've given the listener an opportunity for action in your narrative. Second test: are you generating resonance? This will tell you whether your black box or story matches both the context, the situation, and the understanding of the listeners. Third test: is the story, black box, or label complex enough, or perhaps too complex. Getting the balance right is critical. So how do you cope when simplification fails? When trying to turn the complicated or the complex into something simple just isn't working? The answer is you have to ask some questions. You have to ask where the failure lies. Is it in the lack of requisite variety? Is it in the kind of narrative you're telling? Or is it in the black boxes, labels, or models that you're using? Or maybe it's a combination of all three of these. And once you've answered the questions, there are 2 steps to take. First, reconstruct your black box as a true model, one that allows you to explore all kinds of what-ifs. It's critical to remember that actions require you to be talking in terms of a model and not merely a description. So if you don't really have a model, then you've got no ability to experiment. You've got no ability to anticipate what happens with a what if I try this or a what if I try that. So what you need to do is determine what it is that you have to do or change or know in order to change what you've got as a description into a true model. With a model, you can rehearse potential actions, and it is that ability to rehearse that gives you resilience and allows you to find a simple narrative to tell. Once again, the most important variable is appropriateness, and there are no shortcuts. If your story or your black boxes, your labels, etc., are either too simple or too complex, they will not resonate. And what matters is how your listeners are reacting. So you need to then think about what you must do so that you can make your black boxes and your story resonate. It is critical for effectiveness that your simple story matches the situation, not in your eyes, but in the eyes and the ears of your listeners. It has to match the situation and it must resonate. Appropriate and resonate. Think of your story and your model like a seesaw. When it is balanced, your listeners will make it obvious. Just remember, it is the listener's perspective, not yours, that matters. Models, not descriptions, which match the situation and which resonate with others. That is the definition of appropriateness. So, are you overwhelmed by the complex? Are you staring at a maze? Not if you have an appropriate narrative. Thank you.